Americans, runaway slaves, had taken over and had been living there for a little while, doing their own thing, living free, and protecting themselves with the armaments in the fort. Well, one day they came by, the United States government came by and shot a cannon into it and destroyed the fort, and then all the African Americans had to flee. A lot of them died, but a lot of them ended up fleeing to other parts of Florida. They ended up establishing communities throughout Florida. One of them was known as Angola, which is right near Sarasota and Tampa, Florida. Angola was named Angola because a lot of them had come from West Central Africa, and they wanted to rename their little community based off of their homeland. 1821 comes around, Andrew Jackson, right, who ended up becoming our president later on, he goes down into Florida and starts raiding all these runaway slave communities, and they end up escaping. A lot of these runaway slaves in Angola in 1821 ended up leaving Florida and escaping to Andros Island in the Bahamas. To this day, you can find a runaway slave community, the descendants of the runaway slave community in Andros Island in the Bahamas. Yeah, Andros Island, in the Bahamas. Not only that, years later, 1818 was the first Seminole War. They sent in more troops to kill the Native Americans and then retrieve the runaway slaves.
Attention visitors, running, horseplay, and playing on or throwing items off balconies is strictly prohibited and will result in an escort out of the building.
This whole conflict resulted in the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish still owned Florida. The Spanish, by 1821, were like, we don't want that work with the United States, so they end up leaving Florida. So they signed a treaty called the Adams-Onis Treaty between the Spanish and the United States. So then Florida becomes a part of the United States. So now guess what happens? In 1821, with the expansion of cotton, all these cotton plantation landowners are all going down into Florida trying to establish plantations. But guess who's in the way? Native Americans and runaway slave communities, all throughout Florida. So this whole time they're trying to get rid of the runaway slave communities and the Native Americans. So by 1835 starts what they call the Second Seminole War. The Second Seminole War was blacker than the First Seminole War. There were way more runaway slaves involved in fighting for their own land and their own freedom. Because even though they signed a treaty with the Spanish government, that didn't mean the Native Americans and the blacks were just going to give up the land. They continued to fight for that land. And the blacks fought so hard that the general at the time, General Jessup, y'all know where Lake Jessup is?
Yeah.
Named after this general that went down into Florida and tried to re-enslave the runaway slaves. He said to Congress, I think it was, he's like, don't be mistaken. He's like, y'all think that this is an Indian war. This Second Seminole War is a Negro war. These blacks are fighting harder than the Indians are to maintain their freedom here in Florida. So in 1838, our government decides to sign a treaty with the runaway slaves, the black Seminoles in Florida, to allow these black Seminoles to go to Oklahoma and get their freedom out in Oklahoma. So there were about 500 runaway slaves that ended up going out into Oklahoma. But not only that, I think one other thing to point out is that the hundreds of runaway slaves that were fighting for their freedom in Florida, they didn't only fight for their own freedom, but they started freeing slaves on the new plantations in Florida, all throughout Central Florida. So this was in fact...
I know.
Oh, she used to always buy me water in class. This was the largest... Yeah, thanks. This was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. There were about 1,000, I think they say like 1,500 slaves involved, along with the runaway slaves in this rebellion. And this was the only slave rebellion in U.S. history where the slaves that revolted and actually killed 400 or 500 U.S. soldiers did not get punished for killing these U.S. soldiers. I don't know why they didn't punish them, but I'm assuming that they didn't want any more problems. But then guess what happened? 1838, the 500 runaway slaves that signed this treaty to go out into Oklahoma, people were trying to re-enslave them in Oklahoma. So they fled down into Mexico. Until this day, you can find the descendants of that runaway slave community down in Mexico, called the Muskogee in northern Mexico. They practiced their own. Huh? You were just there in Mexico too? Y'all visiting your people.
Something like that.
But the thing is interesting is that you can go all over this place. I don't see anything about the Black Summit. And I think one of the reasons why is because this might be me being conspiracy theorist. Because that was actually a success.
I was gonna say, why don't we hear about this? And we live in Florida.
You don't, yeah, well, that's why.
And that's
You find out about the ones that were executed and killed at the end of their conspiracies and rebellions, but you don't really hear anything about the ones that succeeded and signed treaties and end up getting their freedom.
Were those Confederate flags? I know I'm with you all,
Yeah.
or were those Union soldiers?
Which one?
You said the soldiers they were fighting against, were those Confederate soldiers, or were they from?
No, this wasn't during the Civil War yet.
Okay, just wanted to know.
These are just U.S. soldiers.
okay.
Yeah, U.S. American soldiers. So, and I think one of the reasons why we try to shoehorn the African American experience with the American experience. So when we fight against the U.S. government, we fight against U.S. soldiers in our history, it doesn't look like we're trying to. They always trying to make it look like the African Americans are begging for integration and assimilation with the U.S. When in fact, it was the opposite for a lot of the history. They wanted out. Want anything to do with it. Why would you want to be included? You know? And it's not to say everybody was like that, but there's a big portion of the narrative that's being excluded here because it doesn't fit in with the greater American narrative of I want to be a part of this dream and I want, you know. Some people were like, this is a nightmare. We want out.
So they don't have hair till Michelle out. They have her handkerchief and her hymn book. Michelle is not there. But it was a few years ago when I came here without. They have it on a mannequin. They come like, wow. So, you know, and what they have to do, they can't leave artifacts out all the time because the lighting will mess them up. So they